It was New Year's Eve, 2013, when David Anderson and Sarah Jones locked their front door for what would be the last time. The neighborhood was alive with distant fireworks, bursts of red and green flashing against the midnight sky, but the couple seemed oddly out of place in the celebration. David glanced over his shoulder as if checking for someone, his brow furrowed, while Sarah clutched her small purse tightly. Her steps hurried, her eyes darting nervously in the cold air. They were supposed to be heading to a friend's party, yet something in their movements felt more like a getaway than a celebration. A security camera from across the street caught the final known moments of them together. The black and white footage showed David leading Sarah to their car, his hand hovering protectively over her back. The timestamp flickered, December 31, 2013, 11:46 p.m. In the grainy image, Sarah's silver necklace caught a glint of light, a tiny flash that would later haunt investigators when they realized it was the last visible trace of her existence. Neighbors would later swear they saw the car, a dark sedan, pulling out of the driveway, headlights cutting through the icy street, vanishing into the mist that rolled down from the nearby hills. What they didn't notice at the time, but investigators later pointed out, was the strange distortion in the footage, a faint flicker, like static, that rippled across the frame the moment the car turned the corner, almost as if reality itself had bent for just a second. At first glance, nothing about that night seemed extraordinary, just two young adults heading out into the festive chaos of the new year. But those who knew David and Sarah would later describe how tense they seemed in the days leading up to their disappearance. Sarah had told her closest friend she had been hearing strange noises outside the house at night, faint footsteps, whispers that drifted through her bedroom window. David, usually calm, had been snapping at small things, pacing in the living room long after midnight. The story that begins here is not just about the people vanishing. It is about what happens when the shadows that stalk us suddenly step into the light, when the line between ordinary life and something unspeakable blurs. Because after that night, David and Sarah would never be seen alive again, and the camera that caught their final steps, that footage would later become the centerpiece of a mystery that still chills to the bone. Not just because they vanished, but because of what else seemed to appear in the static, when slowed down frame by frame. Something that no one could quite explain. By dawn on New Year's Day, friends waiting at the party realized David and Sarah had never shown up. At first, no one thought much of it. Maybe they decided to celebrate alone, maybe plans had changed last minute. But as hours turned into days, concern grew heavy. Neither David's phone nor Sarah's went through. Calls went straight to voicemail, and messages remained unread. When police were finally alerted, the investigation began with the most obvious step, tracing their route from home to the party. It was barely a 20-minute drive, yet not a single camera app to their street captured their car. It was as though, after that final security camera clip, the vehicle simply evaporated into the cold night air. Detectives questioned neighbors, friends, co-workers. Everyone described the couple as ordinary, responsible, and deeply in love. No reason to run away, no debts, no criminal ties. Their bank account sat untouched. The only trace was that grainy security camera footage, flickering with strange static the moment they drove away. But the deeper police dug, the stranger it became. When detectives visited the Andersons' home, they found the front door locked from the outside, just as the footage showed. Inside, however, a chill lingered in the air as though the windows had been left open, except they hadn't. On the kitchen table lay two in-touch glasses of champagne, still half-filled, with the faint scent of citrus and something else, something metallic. Sarah's best friend insisted she had been afraid in the weeks before. She told me she thought someone was watching them, the friend confessed, her voice trembling. She said she'd wake up at night and hear footsteps, whispering, but when David checked, no one was there. Detectives filed it as paranoia, but when they reviewed the security footage again, one officer swore he saw something moving in the static, a faint, shadow-like figure standing by the corner of the street, vanishing the moment the headlights turned. At first, it was dismissed as an artifact of poor quality tape, but when slowed frame by frame, the outline of a human shape became disturbingly clear. And then came the calls. Within days of the couple's disappearance, neighbors began reporting strange late-night phone rings. No caller ID. When answered, only silence. A few claimed they heard faint breathing. One man even said he heard Sarah's voice whisper his name. Before the line cut to static, the investigation, which began as a missing persons case, was quickly spiraling into something darker. The couple hadn't simply vanished. Something had taken them. 10 years passed. The city of St. Louis moved on, but for the families of David and Sarah, time never healed. Their case became one of Missouri's most infamous cold cases. Every year, on December 31st, Mrs. Jones lit a candle on her porch, hoping her daughter would somehow find her way home. But the answer wouldn't come from the city. It would come from the wilderness. On the evening of October 18, 2019, two hikers, college friends named Emily and Trevor, ventured deep into the wooded trails near Bay Lake, a remote body of water about 50 miles outside St. Louis. The area was notorious for abandoned structures, broken barns, forgotten wells, and crumbling concrete foundations left behind by farmers long gone. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Emily noticed something unusual: a faded strip of cloth snagged on the branch of a dead tree, white, but stained dark at the edges. She pulled it down, and both froze when they realized the fabric was brittle, weathered, and torn in a way that suggested violence. They pressed on, their flashlights cutting through the thickening fog. The forest seemed unnaturally silent. Even the usual sounds of crickets and owls had vanished. That's when Trevor spotted it, a structure ahead, half collapsed, covered in vines. An old barn. The air smelled of damp earth, rust, and something sour. Inside, the beams groaned under their weight. Dust and cobwebs hung heavy in the air. Against the back wall, half hidden under a rotting tarp, sat a vehicle, a black Toyota Camry. Its windows were smashed, its hood dented, and its body streaked with faded scratches. Emily's hands shook as she brushed away the dirt on the license plate. The numbers matched exactly the missing couple's car. But the horror didn't end there. Just beyond the barn, behind a cluster of trees, was a hollow concrete structure, a cistern. The cover had long since cracked, leaving a dark opening into the earth. When Trevor shined his light down into the pit, the beam caught something pale and twisted, tangled among roots and debris. Bones! They ran. Emily called 911 with trembling hands, her voice almost incoherent. Within an hour, police swarmed the area, sealing it off. The discovery was no accident. Someone had hidden the car, the remains, and perhaps more. That night, news spread like wildfire. A decade-long mystery had resurfaced. But even as detectives rushed to confirm the identities, whispers spread among the search teams. Those who peered into the cistern swore they heard something impossible, faint whispers rising from below, voices that sounded like Sarah's, soft, pleading, echoing through the night air. The Anderson Jones case was no longer just a tragedy. It was a nightmare, clawing its way back from the dark. The night air around Bay Lake was electric with unease. Police cars lined the dirt road, their red and blue strobes cutting through the fog like a heartbeat. Officers sealed the perimeter, but the quiet, suffocating dread of the place made even seasoned detectives whisper. It wasn't just another crime scene. It felt wrong. Detective Mike Harrison stepped inside the barn first. His flashlight beam swept across the rotting interior, revealing broken tools, rusted chains dangling from the rafters, and a floor slick with years of mold. He approached the vehicle, the black Toyota Camry. Its once shiny paint was now eaten away by rust, but under the grime, streaks remained. Dark stains, blood, maybe dragged across the surface. He didn't need lab results to feel the truth radiating from it. Nearby, crime scene techs took photographs, their flashes momentarily burning the shadows into stark white. The silence of the forest pressed down on them, broken only by the faint drip of water leaking from the rafters. The barn seemed to breathe, every creak of its old bones echoing like a groan of protest. But the real horror lay beyond, at the cistern. The cracked concrete pit yawned like a mouth in the earth, its edges tangled in vines. Harrison leaned over cautiously, his flashlight cutting into the darkness. The beam revealed something pale and tangled. Bones, hunched and collapsed upon one another. Among them, fabric clung, shredded white cloth, still clinging to the skeletal frame. A piece of Sarah's iconic dress. For a moment, the night seemed to hold its breath. And then, the whispers, not loud, not clear, but undeniable. A faint female voice, carried from below. "Help me." The officers froze. Some stepped back, others swore under their breath. Harrison tightened his grip on the flashlight, jaw set, refusing to believe what he was hearing. He ordered the divers to rig ropes and lights. When the flood lamps flicked on, the pit glowed with an unnatural haze. The remains inside seemed impossibly fresh, as if untouched by a decade of decay. The divers lowered themselves in, their movements slow, deliberate. One of them gagged as he reached the bottom. "Detective, there's more." They weren't just bones. There were fragments of another body, larger, slumped beside the first. "David." When they lifted the remains, the air grew colder. Cameras glitched. One officer's body cam recorded static surges, strange streaks of white moving like figures across the frame. But to the naked eye, nothing was there. By dawn, the bodies were recovered, tagged, and covered. Harrison stood at the barn's doorway as the fog lifted, staring out at the tree line. The case was no longer about missing persons. It was murder. Brutal, deliberate, but something else lingered in the silence, something older, watching, and though no one admitted it out loud, every officer that night left with the same knowing thought: The forest had not given up its secrets willingly.
The sterile chill of the morgue was a world away from the haunted barn, yet the air here felt no less heavy. The autopsy room glowed in sterile white light, buzzing faintly, but even here shadows clung stubbornly to the corners. Two metal tables stood at the center, each bearing a body wrapped in white sheets. For the first time in over 10 years, David Anderson and Sarah Jones had been brought home, but not alive. Forensic pathologist Dr. Elaine Carter pulled the sheet back from Sarah's remains. The room fell silent. Her bones were fractured, wrists marked with deep grooves that spoke of rope bindings. A portion of fabric still clung to her ribcage, the torn edge of the white dress she'd worn on that final night. Her skull bore cracks, blunt force trauma delivered with precision. She didn't die quickly, Dr. Carter whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Detective Harrison stood nearby, jaw tense, refusing to look away. He needed the truth, no matter how brutal. Next was David. His remains told their own story: fractured knuckles, shattered forearm bones. He had fought. The defensive wounds screamed of desperation. His ribs had been crushed by repeated blows, and his skull carried the same brutal signature as Sarah's, a crowbar most likely. He tried to protect her, Harrison muttered, voice low. But the most disturbing detail wasn't the violence. It was the condition of the remains. Despite being submerged for more than a decade, certain fragments of soft tissue appeared oddly preserved, not natural, not explainable by science. Samples taken from the bones revealed traces of chemicals, compounds used in construction sites, the very same linked to the environmental crimes David had once testified against. As photographs snapped, one technician froze, staring at the monitor displaying close-ups of the wounds. "Detective, look at this." Harrison leaned in. At high magnification, the cracks in Sarah's skull seemed etched with faint, branching lines like roots or veins of mold. The technician swore the lines shifted slightly under the light, but when others looked, they were motionless. The morgue grew colder. The overhead lights flickered, buzzing louder. One officer swore he heard a whispering voice, the same plea from the cistern. "Help me." This time, louder. Dr. Carter nearly dropped her scalpel. Harrison clenched his fists, grounding himself in the reality of blood and bone, refusing to indulge the creeping terror. But in his gut, he knew. The violence was human: revenge, cruelty, corruption. Yet something else had attached itself to this case, feeding on it. The corpses carried not only scars of murder, but whispers of something that should have remained buried.
By the time the autopsy reports were completed, the conclusion was clear. David and Sarah were murdered, silenced for standing up against powerful men. But the faint traces, the preservation, the whispers, the unnatural markings, suggested that their suffering had not ended with death, and that realization haunted every person who stood in that morgue. The truth didn't come all at once. It crept into the investigation, piece by piece, until it formed a picture more horrifying than anyone expected. The partial license plate from the grainy gas station footage was the first crack. Enhanced frame by frame, the numbers revealed themselves like ghosts from static. The plate belonged to a white Ford Focus registered to Jack Miller, a former security guard at the construction company David had exposed. Detective Harrison followed the trail with mounting dread. Miller wasn't alone. Records revealed his close association with Tom Peterson, a construction foreman, and Robert Matthews, the owner of the abandoned property where the Camry had been hidden. And behind them all, pulling strings from the shadows, was William Johnson, an executive director of the company David had testified against. The pieces clicked together with sickening precision. The night of December 31st, 2009, had not been an accident. It had been an ambush, a carefully orchestrated act of revenge disguised beneath the chaos of celebration. David and Sarah had been hunted, cornered, and silenced. When detectives moved in to arrest Miller, he cracked under pressure. In the dim interrogation room, his face pale and trembling, he confessed, "We didn't mean to kill her." Johnson said, "Just scare them. Just scare them." His voice broke, but Anderson fought back. He fought back hard. And then it all went wrong. As the confession spilled out, so did the horror. David's car had been rammed. He'd been dragged from the wreckage, beaten with a crowbar. Sarah had screamed, tried to flee, but was bound, sobbing, begging for mercy. Johnson had ordered her execution, cold and final. No witnesses. Miller whispered, staring at the table as if he still saw the blood. But even here, In the sterile walls of the station, something felt wrong. As Miller described the cistern, his words faltered. "We threw them in," but his eyes widened and his voice dropped to a rasp. She was still whispering. The room fell silent. Hours later, I swear I heard her voice echoing out of that hole, asking for help. Detective Harrison exchanged glances with his partner. A chill moved through the room. Miller was no superstitious man, yet his confession carried a weight of something more than guilt, something that lingered in the dark. Within weeks, all 4 men were in custody. Johnson, the mastermind, stood in court with cold defiance, but beneath his composure lay the cracks of fear. Reporters claimed his eyes darted toward empty corners of the courtroom, as if watching something no one else could see. Peterson and Matthews avoided eye contact entirely, their faces pale, haunted. Justice was finally closing in. Yet, as Harrison filed the paperwork late one night, he couldn't shake the sound that played in his mind. Sarah's final whisper. It wasn't only in Miller's imagination. It had been real, and some part of her, of both of them, still reached out, caught between silence and the truth. It was April 13, 2010, when the search finally came to an unbearable conclusion. The detective stood silently before an abandoned cistern on the outskirts of the old sugarcane farm. Nature had nearly swallowed the structure, vines twisting across its cracked concrete walls, as if trying to hide the secrets buried within. Detective Harrison wiped sweat from his brow. Even though the night was chilling cold, he signaled for the crew to pry open the heavy lid. The moment the air escaped from within, it was as if death itself had exhaled. A foul stench rose from the cistern, so heavy and sickening that one of the younger officers doubled over, retching. The others held firm, though their faces were pale with dread. Flashlights pierced the darkness inside, beams dancing across the stagnant water below. At first, it was nothing but shadows. Then, the shapes became clearer. 2 forms, fragile, distorted, yet unmistakably human. At the bottom lay the decomposed remains of David and Sarah. Their clothes were shredded, their bodies collapsed into twisted postures that spoke of violence and despair. David's hand still bore his wedding ring, its faint glint catching the flashlight for a fleeting second, a cruel reminder of love now reduced to bones. Nearby, Sarah's necklace hung from her chest, dulled but still intact. It was the same necklace her mother had given her on her 18th birthday, now lying silently in the pit of horror. The silence was unbearable. Only the echo of a crow's call, somewhere in the distance, dared to interrupt the moment. Detective Harrison clenched his fist. This was no longer a missing persons case. This was murder, cold, deliberate, and monstrous. The officers exchanged hollow looks, each one carrying the same thought. They had uncovered not just a crime scene, but the final chapter of 2 lives stolen. The cistern had become their tomb, sealed in secrecy until fate forced the truth to the surface. When the remains were retrieved, the evidence was damning. Rope burns on Sarah's wrists, fractures in David's skull. Both had suffered unimaginable violence before being discarded like trash. It was the confirmation everyone feared, but also the breakthrough the families had prayed for. The horror was now undeniable. David and Sarah had not run away, had not vanished into thin air. They had been hunted, silenced, and buried in darkness. As the night grew heavier, the detectives knew the case had shifted forever. The truth was out, but behind it, even darker questions lingered. Who had done this? And why? March 15, 2011, exactly 1 year after Sarah's purse was found, the courtroom in downtown St. Louis was packed with silence heavy enough to suffocate. Families of David and Sarah sat in the front row, hands clenched together, eyes burning with grief and expectation. At the center of it all stood William Johnson, the corporate director who had ordered the nightmare. Beside him, Jack Miller and Tom Peterson, the men who carried out the brutal act, stared forward with cold, vacant eyes. The judge's voice echoed like a hammer striking steel as he recounted the evidence. The abandoned car in the barn, the bloodstains beneath the carpet, the eyewitness testimony of Samuel Miller, the rope burns on Sarah's wrists, the fractures in David's skull. Piece by piece, the story of betrayal and revenge unfolded, and with every word, the weight of justice bore heavier upon the accused. When the verdict was read guilty on all counts, the room erupted in sobs and whispers. William Johnson was sentenced to 42 years in prison. His accomplices received 28 to 36 years each. The families wept, not out of triumph, but because the endless nightmare had finally reached its final chapter. Yet even then, there was no true peace. As Mrs. Jones whispered through her tears, "Justice has been done, but it will never bring my Sarah back." The world outside the courtroom seemed unchanged. Cars honked, people rushed home, and the city lights flickered on as the sun set. But for the families, everything had shifted forever. David and Sarah's lives had been extinguished by greed and cruelty, leaving only memories and the hollow comfort of closure. That night, As the families gathered in their homes, some swore they could still feel David and Sarah's presence, a fleeting warmth, a shadow passing through the hallway, a whisper carried on the wind. Perhaps it was grief, or perhaps something far darker. For late that evening, a janitor working the empty courtroom swore he heard something unusual. As he pushed his mop across the wooden floors, he felt the temperature drop, the lights flickered, shadows stretching longer than they should have. And then, faintly, he heard it, a woman's voice, broken and trembling, whispering from the judge's bench. "Help me, it's not over." The janitor froze, staring at the empty room. His mop slipped from his hands, clattering against the floor. And though he tried to convince himself it was nothing, deep inside he knew David and Sarah's story was finished for the world, but their presence lingered, restless and unseen, a reminder that justice in this world is never enough. The case had ended, but the horror remained.